This experiment was supposed to last 2 full weeks, but it didn't. It was shut down after just 6 days because the people inside of it started to change. Not slowly, fast. College students with no history of violence were assigned to be guards and prisoners. They began turning on each other in ways no one expected. And for years, this story has been used as proof that power can turn ordinary people into something else entirely. But the deeper you look into what actually happened, the less simple that story becomes. Because not everything inside that basement was as natural as it seemed. And some of the most disturbing parts might not be what you've been told. Alright, if you're new here, or you found yourself coming back to the channel a few times, welcome. This is where we get into the darker side of real stories. True crime, psychological experiments, paranormal, horror, things that don't fully make sense, and the kind of cases that stick with you long after you've heard them. So if you're into that kind of stuff, you'll probably feel right at home here. So if you do end up enjoying the video, or you find yourself coming back here, consider subscribing. It really does help the channel grow, and it lets me keep diving into stories like this. Now, let's get into what actually happened inside the Stanford Prison Experiment. So, grab a light, and let's step into the dark together.
University, an experiment was conducted that became a classic in the annals of social psychology.
Professor Philip Zimbardo conducted a legendary experiment by randomly assigning students to the roles of prison guards and prisoners. The experiment proved so dangerous that he had to end it prematurely.
The year is 1971. At Stanford University, a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo is preparing to run an experiment. His goal is to understand how ordinary people behave when placed in a position of power, and what happens when that power is taken away. At the time, there was growing interest, especially from places like the U.S. Office of Naval Research, in understanding behavior inside prisons. So, Zimbardo puts out an ad in the newspaper. Male college students needed for a psychological study of prison life. The pay, $15 a day, which, adjusted for today, is roughly around $110 to $120 a day. Over 70 young men apply. Most of them are just college students. College students looking for a summer job, extra money, something different, not realizing what they're actually signing up for. But after a series of psychological evaluations and personality tests, only 24 are chosen. All of them are considered mentally stable, physically healthy, and no history of violence. Just normal college students. They're told that the experiment is going to last 2 weeks. They'll be randomly assigned roles. Some will be guards, and others will be prisoners. And it was completely random, as simple as a flip of a coin. And according to later accounts, when asked before the coin flip, not a single one of them actually said they wanted to be a guard. Now, what they don't fully realize is just how real this experiment is about to become. Because this isn't just a simulation. Zimbardo and his team transformed the basement of Stanford's psychology building into a functioning prison. Bars on the doors, solitary confinement cells, surveillance cameras watching every move. And before the experiment even officially began, something happens. Something that sets the tone for everything that follows. Before the experiment officially begins, the prisoners are sent home and told to wait. No uniforms, no prison setting, no real sense of what's about to happen. Just a normal day. Until it isn't. Because, without warning, there's a knock at the door. And when they open it, it's not a researcher standing there. It's the police. Real officers from the Palo Alto Police Department. And before they can even fully process what's happening, they're told to turn around, to put their hands behind their back, and they're searched right there, in front of their homes. Neighbors start to notice, people watching them from the windows, family members confused, asking questions that no one is answering. And even though some of the students try to laugh it off at first, that feeling doesn't last long, because those officers never break character. They don't explain anything, they don't reassure them, they just keep going as if this is completely real. They're placed into the back of a police car and driven to an actual police station. They're booked, fingerprinted, mugshots taken, one step after another, just like a real arrest. And at no point does anyone step in to remind them this is just an experiment. By the time they're finished processing, that line between roleplay and reality is already starting to blur. They're blindfolded, disorientated, and transported to the basement of Stanford University, now fully transformed into a prison. When the blindfolds finally come off, everything feels different. They're no longer being treated like students. They're told to strip, their clothes are taken, replaced with loose, ill-fitted smocks with nothing underneath, rubber sandals on their feet, a stocking cap pulled over their head meant to simulate a shaved scalp. It's uncomfortable, exposing, but intentional. Then comes the final step. Each of them is assigned a number, and from that moment on, they are no longer addressed by their name, only that number. And as simple as it seems, that's the moment something shifts, because in just a few hours, these 24 normal college students have already started to lose who they are. At first, it almost feels like a game. The guards arrive and they're given uniforms, khaki shirts, wooden batons, and mirrored sunglasses, so no one could see their eyes. They're told one rule: they can't physically harm the prisoners, but beyond that, they are given the control. And at the beginning, you can feel the hesitation. The guards laugh a little, exchange looks with each other, like they're not entirely sure how far they're supposed to take this. The prisoners still act like themselves, talking normally, joking, trying to keep things light. But that doesn't seem to last long, because it starts small. The guards begin giving orders: stand up, line up, state your number, and when prisoners hesitate, the tone shifts. Again, louder this time: state your number. They're no longer being called by their names, only numbers.
Prisoners must address the guards as Mr. Correctional Officer.
Prisoners must address the guard as Mr. Correctional Officer.
How must prisoners address themselves?
By number only.
How?
By number only.
And they're expected to repeat them over and over again, like it's the only thing that matters. Then come the punishments. Push-ups. At first, it's almost played off as discipline, but it doesn't stay that way. Guards begin placing their boots on the prisoners' backs, forcing them lower, correcting them, pushing harder and harder. Not because they have to, but because they can.
You want to say kick? Is that what it is? Then what the hell are you talking about?
I didn't know you lied. Nobody wants to do any lying in here, 209-3. Why don't you shoot some lying on the ground?
Yes, Mr. Correctional.
Spread your arms out. 209-3, how about 5 push-ups right now? Fast. 1, 2.
And the night doesn't offer any relief. The prisoners are woken up over and over again, count after count, standing in line, half asleep, being forced to repeat their numbers again and again and again. And if someone messes up, everyone pays for it. Blankets are taken, privileges are removed, the rules begin to change depending on the guard in charge. And that's really when things start to feel different, because it's no longer about structure, it's about control. The guards begin to lean into their roles, their postures change, their tone sharpens. Even the way they move through the space becomes more deliberate, more authoritative, more intimidating. And behind those mirrored sunglasses, there's no eye contact, no human connection, just commands. And the prisoners feel it. You can see it in the way they start to respond now. Quieter, more hesitant, less like students, and more like something else. Because the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to remember this isn't real. And that's the problem, because while the prisoners are starting to lose themselves, the guards are starting to find something they weren't expecting. Something they probably didn't even know was there. And for the first time, it's clear this isn't just an experiment anymore. It's turning into something else entirely. By the second day, the tension inside that basement has already started to boil over. The prisoners are exhausted, humiliated, disorientated. They've been stripped of their names, forced into routines, woken up in the middle of the night for endless counts and petty punishments. And eventually, something in them pushes back. A rebellion begins. The prisoners barricade themselves inside their cells. They shove their beds against the doors, rip off their stocking caps, refuse to follow orders. And for the first time since arriving, they try to take some control back. And for a moment, it probably feels like they can. But the guards don't respond like nervous college students trying to keep order. They responded like men who feel like their authority has been challenged. And that challenge changes everything. The guards call in reinforcements from the next shift. Together, they force their way into the cells. The beds are ripped out. Prisoners are dragged away from the doors. The rebellion is crushed, almost as quickly as it started. But it doesn't end there, because now, the guards want to make an example out of them. The ones seen as ringleaders are singled out, punished harder, humiliated more openly. And this is where the experiment starts becoming even more disturbing. Guards begin dividing prisoners against each other. Some are thrown into solitary confinement. Others are moved into what becomes known as the privilege cell. And it's kind of important, because the privilege cell isn't a reward in any real sense. It's a strategy. The prisoners placed in there are given slightly better treatment, food, a little rest, their clothes back, but not because the guards are showing mercy, because they want the others to see it. They want resentment, confusion, distrust, and it works. Instead of uniting, the prisoners start turning inward, wondering who's cooperating, who's being favored, who's giving in. The guards aren't just controlling them physically now, they're controlling the entire emotional atmosphere of the prison. And the punishments start to become more degrading. Push-ups aren't just push-ups anymore. They're made to perform them when guards stand over them, while insults are thrown at them, while their bodies begin to give out. Toilets become a tool for humiliation too. At one point, the prisoner buckets are removed from the cells, making them rely completely on the guards for permission to use the bathroom. And when that permission isn't given, the filth stays with them. The prison becomes dirtier, more miserable, more claustrophobic, and the environment itself starts to break them down. The lights, the confinement, the noise, the unpredictability. Every part of the setup starts doing exactly what it was designed to do. Crush identity, create dependence, reinforce power. And by now, the guards are no longer just reacting to bad behavior. They're inventing new ways to dominate. They again make prisoners repeat their numbers again and again. They interrupt sleep, punish one prisoner for another prisoner's mistake. It starts becoming less about rules and more about total control. And what makes this part so unsettling is how quickly the guards adapted to it. Remember, these are not trained correctional officers. They're not hardened men pulled from a violent system. They're normal college students. Young men who, just days later, answered a newspaper ad for some extra money. And yet, now, inside this basement, with uniforms on, mirrored sunglasses hiding their eyes, and almost no meaningful oversight, some of them begin acting with startling cruelty. Not all of them. That's important. Not every guard becomes abusive in the same way. Some stay more passive, some hang back, some seem uncomfortable. But others lean all the way in. They become more aggressive, more creative in their punishments, more invested in maintaining control. And that may be one of the most chilling parts of the entire experiment. Because the cruelty doesn't come from some cartoon villain. It comes from ordinary people adjusting to a role faster than anyone expected. Meanwhile, the prisoners are unraveling. The rebellion failed. Their punishment is escalating. There's no clear sense of when a command will turn into humiliation. No privacy, no predictability, no real escape from the atmosphere being built around them. And for some of them, that stress starts showing fast. Not just frustration, not just anger, real emotional collapse. One prisoner in particular begins to break down early. His thinking becomes disorganized. His emotions become harder to control. He cries. He screams. He becomes overwhelmed in a way that can't be brushed off as not playing along. He's no longer reacting like someone in a study. He's reacting like someone in distress. And even that doesn't immediately stop the experiment. And that's kind of what makes this feel like the peak. Because by now, every warning sign in there, the guards are escalating, the prisoners are deteriorating, the atmosphere is toxic. The line between simulation and reality is almost gone. And still, it keeps going. No hard reset, no immediate shutdown, no moment where everyone suddenly steps back and says, "What are we doing?" Instead, the basement keeps moving forward like it's in its own world, with its own rules, its own power structure, and its own logic. And the people inside it are sinking deeper by the hour. By this point, the Stanford Prison Experiment is no longer revealing how people behave under pressure. It's showing what can happen when pressure, power, humiliation, and authority are allowed to feed each other unchecked. And inside that basement, it's becoming painfully clear that this is no longer under control. By now, the prison in the basement isn't just a setting anymore. It has its own rhythm, its own rules, and its own atmosphere. The people inside it are starting to respond to that atmosphere as if it's the only world that exists. The guards are no longer improvising. They don't hesitate anymore. They don't second guess themselves. They move through the prison like they belong there. Like this authority is something they've grown used to carrying. Some of them become noticeably harsher as the time goes on, more aggressive, more creative in how they punish. Others stay quieter, more passive, but still don't step in to stop what's happening. And that part matters, because it shows even the ones who weren't actively cruel still allowed it to continue. And the prisoners feel that shift immediately. Because once people stopped acting like they were pretending, everything gets heavier. It's not just the punishments anymore, not just the counts, the commands, the humiliation. It's the realization that no one around you is grounded anymore. Not the guards, not the research staff, not even Philip Zimbardo. Because Zimbardo isn't just observing anymore. Inside the experiment, he's taken on the role of the prison superintendent. And years later, he would admit that at times he stopped thinking like a researcher and started thinking like the person in charge of the prison. Which means the one person who should have been stepping back and asking, "What is happening here?" was instead becoming part of the system itself. And you can feel that in the way things start to unfold. When prisoners began showing real signs of distress, the response isn't immediate concern. It's management, containment, procedures. One of the earliest breakdowns comes from prisoner number 8612, Douglas Corpy. Inside the experiment, he becomes overwhelmed, angry, emotionally unstable. He yells, cries, breaks down in a way that feels very real in that moment. And he is released early.
8612, against the wall. You. Against the wall, you.
Life can be very difficult, or it can be a lot easier.
Like, if I gotta be in here, I'm not gonna put up with it.
8612, I think you have to spend all time in the hole. You're 8612. Spend more time in the hole.
It's a good place to get to know well. Anything. You don't know me, I'm young, I didn't get out. I didn't. Don't tell me not to try, don't you know him? Don't tell me not.
But what makes this even more complicated is what comes out years later. Corpy would later claim that he exaggerated parts of his breakdown, that he was just trying to get out of the experiment. At one point, he suggested he faked it. But that story doesn't stay consistent. Zimbardo would later push back on that, saying Corpy changed his version of events multiple times over the years. So even now, there's debate over what was real and what wasn't. But in that moment, inside the prison, it didn't feel staged. It felt like someone losing control. And instead of stopping everything, the experiment continued. That's what makes this part so disturbing, because every time reality tried to break through, that system absorbed it. A breakdown isn't treated as a warning sign, it's treated as a disruption, something to remove so everything else can keep going. And slowly, that way of thinking spreads, even to the prisoners themselves. Because at a certain point, some of them stop thinking like volunteers, start thinking like inmates. There's a moment where prisoners are brought before a parole board. One by one, they're asked if they want to leave, if they're willing to give up the money, just to get out. And many, if not all, say yes. They don't care about the pay anymore. They just want out. But instead of simply just standing up and walking away, they wait. They sit there, as if their release depends on someone else's decision, as if they need permission, as if they are no longer free to choose. And that moment says everything, because physically, they were never truly locked in, but psychologically, they were. That loss of control shows up again in one of the most disturbing moments of the entire experiment. A prisoner, number 819, is already in visible distress, emotional, overwhelmed, and instead of helping him, the guards line up the others and have them chant, "Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner," over and over and over again. And as the chant fills the room, he breaks down completely. Not just from humiliation, but because by that point, he starts to believe it. He sees himself as that number, as that label. And when Zimbardo finally pulls him aside and tells him, "You're not number 819, this isn't real," it doesn't land right away. Because for him, it already is real. And that moment has been pointed to again and again as one of the clearest signs of just how far things had gone. How quickly identity can be stripped away and replaced with something imposed. Looking back on the experiment years later, critics would argue that the structure itself encouraged this outcome, that the guards weren't just randomly becoming cruel, but they were subtly guided, influenced, even pushed in certain directions. Some would say that the experiment wasn't as natural as it seemed, that it wasn't just human nature unfolding, but something shaped behind the scenes. And that's where the story becomes even more complicated, because now it's not just about what happened inside that basement, it's about how much of it was allowed to happen, and how much of it may have been encouraged. But inside the moment, none of that is being questioned. Inside the moment, the guards are deeper in their roles than ever. The prisoners are deteriorating, and the structure is holding everything in place, even as the people inside are coming apart. The schedule continues, the commands continue, the punishment continues, as if nothing is wrong, as if this is all still under control. But at this point, it's clear, whatever this started as, it isn't that anymore. And somehow, it's still going. By the 6th day, the people inside that basement had been living in the experiment long enough that the abnormality was starting to feel normal. Not just that the guards had become harsher, not just that the prisoners were deteriorating, but the people closest to it had stopped seeing it clearly. Because by then, Philip Zimbardo was no longer functioning like the detached researcher standing outside the situation and observing it from a safe distance. He had taken on the role of prison superintendent, and later he openly acknowledged that he had started thinking more like the superintendent of a prison than a psychologist running a study. And when that happens, the danger changes. Because once the person in charge is emotionally inside the system he created, the system no longer has a real safeguard. By that point, there had already been emotional breakdowns, prisoners had already been humiliated, degraded, and pushed far past what anyone should have accepted as just part of an experiment. The guards had grown more comfortable with control, and according to Zimbardo's own later accounts, some of that abuse had escalated during the night, when they believed researchers were not watching and the experiment was effectively off. He later described some of that behavior as increasingly degrading and somehow, even with all of that, the experiment was still moving forward. Then, Christina Maslach walked in. Maslach was a recent Stanford PhD who had been brought in to conduct interviews with the guards and prisoners. She was not someone who had been absorbed into the rhythm of the prison from the beginning. She came in with outsider eyes. And that distance mattered. What she saw shocked her. According to the official Stanford Prison Experiment account, she saw the prisoners being marched to the bathroom with bags over their heads, their legs chained together, and their hands resting on one another's shoulders. It looked less like a classroom study and more like a movement of actual inmates through a degrading institutional process. And unlike the dozens of other people who had already seen some part of the prison and failed to stop it, Maslach reacted immediately. Zimbardo's own account says she was filled with outrage and told him, "It's terrible what you are doing to these boys." He later wrote that out of more than 50 outsiders who had seen the mock prison, she was the only one who openly challenged its morality. That line matters so much because it cuts through everything the experiment had become. Not the idea of scientific observation, just the reality of it. These were boys, young men, college students, and what was being done to them had crossed a line so badly that someone seeing it fresh could recognize it almost immediately. The official Stanford FAQ says that the real ending differed from the movie version. In the real study, Maslach confronted Zimbardo and told him that by taking on the superintendent role, he had become indifferent to the suffering of his participants. And according to that account, he realized she was right, and announced that he would end the study the next day. That detail is important too, because it shows just how deep the immersion had gone. He didn't stop the prison because a spreadsheet told him to. He did not stop it because the prison had naturally run its course. He stopped it because someone from outside the system forced him to see what he had stopped seeing. And once that happened, the illusion broke. Suddenly, the basement was no longer just a prison. It was a room full of students who had been changed by a situation that had gotten away from everyone involved. After only 6 days, the planned 2-week study was called off. And even the way it ended says something unsettling. Zimbardo wrote that after the study was stopped, they held encounter sessions, first with all the guards, then with the prisoners, including the prisoners who were released early, and finally with the guards, prisoners, and staff all together. These sessions were meant to get everyone openly talking about what had happened and to work through the moral conflicts the prison had created. But the emotional aftermath was not as simple as everyone feeling relieved. According to Zimbardo's official account, the prisoners were happy the experiment was over, but many of the guards were upset that it had been terminated early. That detail is chilling, because it suggests that some of the guards had become invested in the structure itself. Invested enough that ending it felt like losing something before they were ready to let it go. And the participants carried pieces of it with them afterward. One of the most striking later reflections come from prisoner number 416, Clayton Clay Ramsey. 2 months after the experiment, he said he began to feel that he was losing his identity, that the person he called Clay, the person who had volunteered to enter the prison, was being replaced by the prisoner's identity imposed on him. He said that to him it was not an experiment or a simulation, it was a prison run by psychologists instead of the state. That quote changes the whole emotional shape of the story, because it shows that at least for some of the men inside it, this wasn't remembered as an intense classroom exercise. It was remembered as something they had felt real enough to alter the way they understood themselves while they were inside it. And that becomes more complicated when you pull back and look at the larger controversy that came later. Over the years, the Stanford Prison Experiment has been criticized heavily, not just ethically, but scientifically. Critics have argued that the guards may have been influenced more than the public was originally led to believe, that the setup was less spontaneous than it was presented, and that later participant accounts have sometimes contradicted one another. Even Zimbardo's own public responses acknowledge ongoing criticism and defend the experiment against more recent attacks. So by the time the study ends, the story has become bigger than what happened in that basement. Now it's about several things at once. It's about power, it's about identity, it's about how quickly people can adapt to cruelty when a system rewards it. It's also about how easily a researcher can become trapped inside the very world he created. Because in the end, the experiment didn't stop on its own. It had to be seen clearly by someone who was still capable of being horrified. And that may be the most human part of the entire story. When everything ends, there isn't a clear sense of resolution. No moment where it all neatly makes sense. Just a group of people stepping out of something that felt real, back into a world where it wasn't supposed to. In the days that follow, the participants are brought back together, not to continue the experiment, but to talk about it, to sit across from each other, guards and prisoners, and try to explain what happened. Why they did what they did, what they were thinking in the moment, and in those conversations, something uncomfortable starts to surface. Because there isn't just one clear version of the story. Some of the guards describe feeling like they were just doing what was expected of them, playing a role, following the tone that had been set. Others admitted that once they stepped into that position, it became easier to push further than they thought they would. And the prisoners? Some describe feeling powerless far sooner than expected, like the environment itself was shaping their behavior faster than they could adjust to it. But even in those early reflections, there are already differences in how people remembered it. And those differences only grow over time, because as the years pass, the Stanford Prison Experiment doesn't just become a study, it becomes a story. One that gets told, retold, and interpreted in different ways depending on who's telling it. In classrooms, it's often presented as a clear example that ordinary people, when given power without limits, can become cruel. That environment shapes behavior, that roles can take over faster than we expect. But outside of that, the story starts to shift. Some former participants have began to speak more openly about their experiences, about what it felt like behind the scenes. And not all of those accounts line up with the version people had come to know. There are claims that the guards weren't entirely left to figure out things on their own. There were moments where direction was given, where tone was suggested, where the line between observation and influence wasn't as clear as it should have been. Audio recordings that surfaced years later add to that conversation, suggesting that certain guards may have been encouraged to create tension, to assert control, to make the environment feel more real. And that changes the way people look at everything, because if behavior is being influenced, then what exactly is being measured? The criticism grows from there, not just about what happened, how, but about how it was allowed to happen, about the lack of boundaries, the emotional harm, the blurred roles between researchers and authority figures. Under modern standards, an experiment like this likely wouldn't be approved, not in the way it was conducted, not without far more oversight. And yet, even with all of that, the study doesn't disappear. It continues to be taught, referenced, debated, because it still raises questions that don't have simple answers. Questions about power, about identity, about how much of who we are is actually stable. How much of it depends on the situations we're placed in. Some argue that the experiment revealed something real, even if the method was flawed. Others argue that the flaws themselves are exactly why the conclusion can't be trusted. And the truth is, those two ideas don't cancel each other out. They sit side by side. Because regardless of how controlled or influenced parts of it may have been, people still responded. They still made choices. They still adapted to the environment that they were placed in. And that leaves the story in a strange place, not as a clean answer, as something more complicated, something that forces you to sit with it and decide what you think it really says about the experiment, and more importantly, about us. This is the part of the story that always sticks with me the most. Not just what happened inside that basement, but everything we still don't fully understand about it. Because no matter how much footage we've seen, no matter how many interviews have been done, no matter how many people have come forward over the years, we will never know exactly what it felt like to be inside that space. Not really. We'll never know what was going through someone's mind in that exact moment that they crossed a line, or the moment they felt like they couldn't leave. We'll never fully understand where the role ended and the person began, and that unknown, that's what draws me to the stories like this. Because it's not just about what we can prove, it's about what we can't. It's about the gray areas, the contradictions, the parts that don't line up perfectly, and the questions that don't have clean answers. Because those are the parts that say the most about us. And when you look at something like this today, you have to wonder how it would have played out now. Would it be shut down immediately? Would people push back sooner? Or would it take a different form entirely? Because the truth is, we like to think that we're more aware now, more informed, more in control. But at the same time, you still hear people talk about influence, about systems, about authority, about the ways people can be shaped without even realizing it, whether that's institutions, social experiments, or even the way people talk about governments having controls in ways we don't always see. And I'm not saying they're the same thing, but it raises a similar kind of question. How much of what we do is actually our own choice? And how much of it is shaped by the environment around us in ways that we don't even notice? That's what makes this story stick, because it doesn't just stay in that basement. It follows you out of it. It makes you look at people differently. It makes you wonder what any of us might be capable of under the right conditions. And that's why I think it's important to talk about stories like this. Not just because they're disturbing or interesting, but because they force us to reflect, to question things, to stay aware of how easily situations can shift, and how quickly people can change inside themselves. And if you've made it this far into the video, I genuinely appreciate you being here. If you enjoyed this deep dive, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, or even sharing this video with someone you think find these kinds of stories interesting. It really does help more than you'd think. I've also seen a few of you asking what's been going on with the short videos and my TikToks. And I know I haven't been posting as many lately, but I was pretty sick for a couple of weeks, and with my full-time job, things just got kind of hectic for a bit, but I am working on getting them back together and getting them in a rhythm again. So if I haven't already started posting them by this time this video is out, you will start seeing those pop up again very soon. I'm trying my best, I swear. And as always, stay curious, stay brave, and stay spooky.